Hidden deep in the mountains, an isolated village developed customs unlike anywhere else. Generations of secrecy and desperation twisted their traditions until even the children were raised to see human flesh as ordinary food at the dinner table. When outsiders finally stumbled upon the community, the truth they uncovered was more horrifying than any legend, forcing the world to confront how isolation and survival can warp the very meaning humanity. For decades, this remote settlement survived completely cut off from civilization, developing their own rules for existence. What started as desperate measures during harsh winters gradually became accepted practice, passed down from parent to child as natural as any family recipe. The children knew no other way of life, gathering around dinner tables where the unthinkable had become routine. But what happens when a community's darkest secrets can no longer stay hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding paths they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Michael Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of gray rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest, they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world. But this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50. With graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads. We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working, and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brenner. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her unease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes. Children peered curiously from doorways while adults watched, with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained as they walked. "Perhaps once or twice a year. If that, most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires, their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching, but something in their excitement struck her as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper, warning she wasn't ready to hear. The guest house was a small log cabin at the edge of the village square, furnished with handmade furniture and oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah set her backpack down and pulled out her journal, quickly sketching the layout of the village while the details were fresh in her memory. Something about this place demanded documentation, though she couldn't yet say what. Michael collapsed onto one of the narrow beds, grateful for any surface softer than the rocky ground they'd been sleeping on for the past 3 nights. "Lucky we found this place," he said. "I was starting to worry we'd be spending another night in the cold." Before Sarah could respond, a knock came at the door. Martha entered carrying a wooden tray with bread, cheese, and what appeared to be herbal tea. Behind her stood an elderly man with a long grey beard and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "This is Elder Matthias," Martha said, setting the tray on the small table. "He leads our community council and wanted to welcome you personally." Matthias stepped forward with a dignity that commanded respect. His clothes were simple but well made, and he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and careful consideration. "Welcome to Haven Valley," he said, extending a weathered hand. "We are a simple people, following the ways our ancestors established when they first settled this valley in 1847. The outside world has changed much, but we have found wisdom in maintaining the old traditions." Sarah shook his hand, noting the calluses of someone who still worked with his hands despite his age. "It's remarkable how well preserved everything is. You must work hard to maintain this way of life." Matthias nodded slowly. "Preservation requires dedication and sometimes difficult choices. Our founders came here fleeing persecution and poverty. They learned that survival in isolation demands different rules than those who live under the protection of governments and laws." He moved to the window, gazing out at the village where families were gathering for the evening meal. "We are entirely self-sufficient. We grow our own food, make our own clothes, educate our own children. The outside world offers many conveniences, but also many corruptions. Here we know where our food comes from, and can trust those who prepare it." Michael, always sociable, leaned forward with interest. "How do you handle medical emergencies? Education beyond basic skills? What about contact with family members who might live elsewhere?" The question seemed to amuse Matthias. "You assume we need such things. Our community healer tends to illnesses and injuries with knowledge passed down through generations. Our children learn everything necessary for life in Haven Valley. As for outside family, we are each other's family now. Those who come here understand they are making a choice between 2 ways of life." Sarah felt a chill at his words. "What about people who might want to leave, to visit the outside world?" Matthias turned back to them, his expression growing more serious. "Why would anyone wish to leave paradise for the chaos and moral decay? beyond our valley. But to answer your question directly, leaving requires the consent of the community council. We cannot allow knowledge of our location to spread carelessly. The outside world would not understand our ways. A bell began ringing from the village square, its tone deep and resonant. Through the window, Sarah watched as families emerged from their homes, and children ran toward the central cooking area, with obvious excitement. "The dinner bell," Martha explained. "You must be hungry after your journey. Our evening meal is communal, a time for the whole village to come together and share the day's blessings." Matthias moved toward the door, then paused. "I should prepare you for our custom. We say grace before meals, thanking the mountain for its provisions, and honoring those who have given their lives to sustain us. Our children may seem enthusiastic about mealtime. They understand the sacred nature of nourishment in ways that outsiders sometimes find surprising." As they walked toward the square, Sarah noticed a framed document hanging near the door of what appeared to be the village's administrative building. The handwritten text was difficult to read in the lamplight, but she could make out phrases like survival protocols and necessary measures for community preservation. The villagers had arranged long wooden tables in the square, and families were taking their seats with an orderliness that suggested long-established routine. Children sat with their parents, hands folded, waiting with remarkable patience for whatever was to come. The cooking fires cast flickering light over the gathering, and the smell of roasted meat grew stronger. Sarah's stomach growled again, but something about the children's anticipation continued to unsettle her. Their excitement seemed different from normal hunger, more intense and primal. Elder Matthias took his place at the head of the main table and raised his hands for silence. The entire village grew still, even the youngest children stopping their fidgeting to focus on their leader with an attention that bordered on reverence. 8-year-old Emma Brennan sat at the children's table, her legs swinging beneath the bench as she waited for the blessing to begin. Her blonde hair was braided with wildflowers she'd picked that afternoon, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. In her small hands, she clutched a leather-bound book filled with her own drawings and careful handwriting. "Mama says we're having the good meat tonight," she whispered to her younger brother Timothy, who was only 5 but already knew to keep his voice down during the pre-meal gathering. "The kind that makes us strong like the mountain." Timothy nodded solemnly, his eyes bright with anticipation. Both children had been taught from their earliest memories that food was sacred, that every meal was a gift that required proper gratitude and understanding. They knew the difference between the regular meat from their livestock and the special meat that appeared only on certain occasions. Sarah, seated at a nearby table between Michael and Martha, couldn't help but overhear the children's conversation. She found their enthusiasm charming in the way all children's excitement about dinner could be, though something in their phrasing struck her as oddly formal for such young voices. Elder Matthias began the blessing, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "Great Mountain, we thank you for your provisions. We honor those who have given their lives that we might continue. We remember that all flesh returns to flesh, and in this sacred cycle we find our strength and purpose." The entire village responded in unison. "We are fed by the mountain's wisdom." Emma opened her little recipe book, revealing pages filled with colorful drawings of meals and ingredients. Her artwork showed the innocent perspective of childhood, but there was something unsettling about the way she'd drawn the central ingredients. The meat in her pictures was always rendered in deep reds and browns, and the faces of the stick figures around the dinner table showed expressions of almost religious ecstasy. As the women began serving the meal, Emma turned to Sarah with the open friendliness that only children possess. "Are you going to like our special dinner? Mama says outsiders sometimes don't understand at first, but once you taste it you'll see why we're so grateful." "I'm sure it will be delicious," Sarah replied, smiling at the girl's earnestness. "Did you help prepare it?" Emma's face lit up with pride. "I helped Uncle Thomas choose the best pieces. He's teaching me and Timothy how to recognize quality. He says we have the finest meat in all the mountains because we know how to honor our sources properly." The first course arrived, a rich dark stew served in carved wooden bowls. The aroma was unlike anything Sarah had encountered, savory and complex, but with an underlying quality that made her stomach turn slightly. She told herself it was just unfamiliar spices, or perhaps the gamey nature of mountain wildlife. Timothy leaned across the table toward Michael, his 5-year-old voice full of innocent enthusiasm. "Mister, have you ever tasted long pig? That's what the grown-ups call it sometimes, but I don't know why, because it doesn't come from pigs." Michael paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth, glancing at Sarah with a puzzled expression. "Long pig? I'm not familiar with that term." Martha, overhearing, quickly intervened with a tight smile. "Children pick up all sorts of phrases. They don't always understand what they're saying." But Emma was eager to share her knowledge. "Uncle Thomas taught us about all the different cuts, and how each one tastes different. The leg meat is good for stewing, but the back meat is better for roasting. And you have to be careful with the organs because they need special preparation." She flipped through her recipe book, showing Sarah a page titled Mama's Special Roast, in careful child's handwriting. The drawing showed a large piece of meat surrounded by vegetables, but the proportions seemed wrong somehow, and the bone structure didn't match any animal Sarah could identify. "Emma, dear," Martha said more firmly, "perhaps you should let our guests eat in peace." But Emma was in full storytelling mode now, the way children get when they have an interested adult audience. "The best part is when we sing the grateful song while Uncle Thomas does the preparing. He says the meat tastes better when it knows it's appreciated." Sarah set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. The child's innocent words carried implications that her mind refused to process fully. She told herself she was misunderstanding, that the isolation and strange customs were making her paranoid. "Emma," Timothy added helpfully, "tell them about the special people who give us the meat, the ones who come to stay with us forever." The adults at the table had grown very quiet, and Sarah noticed that conversations at nearby tables were also dying down as parents began shushing their children with increasing urgency. Elder Matthias stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone. "Children, it's time for you to finish your meals quietly. Our guests need time to appreciate our hospitality without chatter." Emma looked disappointed, but obediently closed her recipe book and picked up her spoon. As she did, Sarah caught a glimpse of the book's cover, where Emma had written in careful letters, "The best ways to thank the mountain's gifts." The meal continued in increasingly uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of eating and the occasional whispered conversation between adults. Sarah found herself watching the children, noting how they approached their food with a reverence that seemed far beyond normal table manners. When Timothy smiled up at her with meat-stained teeth, Sarah felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. The leather-bound diary sat in a glass case within Elder Matthias's home, its pages yellowed with age and brittle from decades of mountain winters. Written in careful script across the cover were the words, "The Winter of 1847, a record of necessity in fading brown ink that might once have been black." After the unsettling dinner, Matthias had invited Sarah and Michael to his home for what he called a proper understanding of our history. The cabin was larger than the others, filled with preserved artifacts and documents that seemed to chronicle the village's entire existence. "Every community has its founding story," Matthias said, carefully opening the diary to its first entry. "Ours began with 23 families fleeing religious persecution in the eastern settlements. They sought a place where they could practice their beliefs without interference, somewhere remote enough that the outside world would leave them in peace." The diary's first entries described the journey into the mountains, the discovery of the hidden valley, and the initial optimism of the settlers. The handwriting belonged to someone named Jeremiah Brennan, presumably an ancestor of Martha's, and his early entries spoke of abundant game, fertile soil, and the promise of a new beginning. They arrived in late summer, Matthias continued, turning the pages with reverent care. The valley seemed perfect. Fresh water, defensible position, enough arable land for their needs. They built their homes quickly, established their gardens, and prepared for their first winter in paradise. Michael leaned forward to examine the diary entries, noting the detailed records of hunting success, crop yields, and community organization. Everything seemed normal, even admirable in its thoroughness and planning. But the winter of 1847 was unlike any in recorded memory, Matthias said, his voice dropping to a more somber tone. The snows came early and stayed late. Game became scarce, then disappeared entirely. Their stored food ran out by February, and by March people were dying. The diary entries from this period told a story of increasing desperation. Jeremiah's careful script recorded the deaths of children and elderly members first, then stronger adults succumbing to starvation. The tone of the writing shifted from hopeful to desperate, to something approaching madness. On March 15th, Matthias read aloud, "We made the decision that has haunted and sustained us ever since." Young Samuel Morrison had died in the night, and as we prepared his body for burial, Elder Thompson made a proposal that shocked us all. The frozen ground made burial impossible, and we had eaten the last of our leather boots 2 days prior. Sarah felt her blood chill as the implications became clear. The diary entry continued in Jeremiah's increasingly shaky handwriting. Elder Thompson reminded us of the stories from the Donner Party, of survival requiring choices that civilized men would normally refuse to make. He said God would forgive us for choosing life over death, for feeding the living rather than honoring the dead. The first time was ceremonial, Matthias explained, his eyes never leaving the diary pages. They prayed over Samuel's body, asked his spirit for forgiveness, took only what they needed to survive another day. Jeremiah writes that the meat tasted like salvation and damnation combined. The entries from late March and April 1847 detailed the systematic consumption of the dead, beginning with those who had died naturally and eventually progressing to more active measures as desperation reached its peak. The writing grew more rationalized, more theological in its justifications. By May, when the snows finally melted, only 14 of the original 91 settlers remained alive, Matthias said. But they had learned something about survival that the outside world could never understand. They had crossed a line that most humans never cross, and in crossing it, they discovered a truth about themselves and about life itself. Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. But that was survival. Desperate circumstances. How did it become a tradition? Matthias turned to the summer entries, where Jeremiah's writing had taken on a different quality. The meat had sustained them through the worst winter in memory. When game returned to the valley, it seemed somehow less nourishing, less satisfying. They had developed a taste for something more substantial, more meaningful. The first deliberate harvest happened in late summer 1847, Matthias continued. A trapper had found the valley and was asking too many questions about the missing members of their community. Jeremiah writes that God delivered this man to them as a test of their commitment to survival and secrecy. The diary entry for August 23, 1847, was written in a steadier hand than the desperate winter entries. It described the planned killing with the same methodical detail previously reserved for recording crop plantings and weather observations. From that point forward, it became clear that their survival depended not just on isolation, but on maintaining their food source through whatever means necessary. The mountain provided, but sometimes the mountain's gifts came in human form. Michael stood abruptly, his face pale. "This is insane. You're talking about murder. About cannibalism as if it's some kind of religious practice." Matthias closed the diary gently and returned it to its case. "We're talking about survival, about a community that learned to do what was necessary to preserve itself. The outside world has its own forms of violence, its own ways of consuming human life. We are simply more honest about ours." Thomas Brennan's workshop occupied a stone building at the far end of the village, its heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands that spoke of both security and secrecy. The ceremonial cleaver hung above his workbench, its blade polished to a mirror shine despite its obvious age. Ornate engravings covered the handle, symbols that seemed to blend Christian imagery with something far older and more primitive. Sarah had excused herself from Matthias's house, claiming she needed fresh air after the historical revelations. In truth, she needed to document what she was seeing, to gather evidence of what was becoming undeniably clear. Her wandering had brought her to this building, drawn by the sound of metal on stone and the low murmur of voices within. Through a gap in the wooden shutters, she could see Thomas instructing two teenage boys in what appeared to be the finer points of his trade. The man was perhaps 45, with the thick arms and steady hands of someone who had spent decades perfecting a craft that required both strength and precision. "The key is respect," Thomas was saying to his apprentices. "Every cut must have purpose. Every piece must be utilized. Waste is the greatest sin we can commit against those who provide for us." One of the boys, perhaps 16, held a smaller version of the ceremonial cleaver. His movements were careful and deliberate as he followed Thomas's guidance. "Like this, Uncle Thomas? Better remember, Marcus, this is not mere butchery. We are performing a sacred act, preparing sustenance that will nourish our families and honor those who have given their lives for our survival." Sarah pressed closer to the window, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone to document what she was witnessing. The workshop was laid out with the efficiency of a professional operation, complete with specialized tools, hanging chains, and preparation surfaces that gleamed with regular maintenance. Thomas lifted the ceremonial cleaver from its place of honor, its weight balanced perfectly in his experienced grip. "This blade has been passed down through 6 generations of our family. My great-great-grandfather used it during the desperate winter when our people first learned the truth about survival. Each man who has wielded it understood his responsibility to the community." The younger apprentice, a boy of perhaps 14, raised his hand tentatively. "Uncle Thomas, when will we know if we're ready to perform the ritual ourselves?" "Patience, David. Readiness comes when you understand that what we do serves a purpose greater than individual comfort. When you can look upon our work not as violence but as a form of worship, honoring both the mountain and those who feed us." Thomas moved to a large wooden table where several cuts of meat lay carefully arranged. Even from her limited vantage point, Sarah could see that the proportions and bone structure were wrong for any animal she recognized. The realization hit her like ice water, confirming what she had been trying to deny since dinner. "The ritual preparation is as important as the ceremony itself," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher sharing sacred knowledge. "We begin with prayers of gratitude, acknowledging the gift we have received. Then we work with reverence, ensuring that every part serves its purpose." Marcus picked up one of the cuts, examining it with the clinical eye of someone learning a trade. "How do we know which parts are best for different preparations?" "Experience teaches us," Thomas replied. "The muscle groups that worked hardest in life provide the richest flavors. The organs require special handling, but offer unique nutritional benefits. The bones make excellent stock for our winter soups." Sarah felt bile rising in her throat as the full implications of the conversation became clear. These weren't hunters discussing wild game or farmers talking about livestock. They were methodically preparing human flesh with the same professional attention that any butcher might give to his craft. "The children are eager to learn," the younger boy observed. "Emma asks questions every day about how we choose which pieces to serve at dinner." Thomas smiled with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Emma has the hunger for knowledge. She understands that our ways are different from the outside world, but she also sees the beauty in our traditions. Children adapt more easily to truth than adults who have been corrupted by outside influences." "What about the new visitors?" Marcus asked quietly. "Will they join us permanently?" Thomas's expression grew more serious. "That decision rests with Elder Matthias and the council. But historically, those who find our valley rarely return to the outside world. The mountain brings us what we need, when we need it." He gestured toward the ceremonial cleaver, its blade catching the lamb. Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding paths they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Michael Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of grey rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest, they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world, but this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads." "We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working, and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brennan. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her unease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes. Children peered curiously from doorways, while adults watched with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained, as they walked. "Perhaps once or twice a year, if that. Most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy but clean and warm. Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires, their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching. But something in their excitement struck her, as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. Confront. This tool has served our community for over a century. It has helped us survive winters that would have killed weaker peoples. It has allowed us to maintain our independence from a world that would destroy us if it could. Sarah backed away from the window, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had witnessed. The casual professionalism, the reverent tone, the systematic approach to what could only be described as ritualized cannibalism. This wasn't desperation or madness. This was a carefully maintained tradition, passed down through generations like any other family trait. As she crept back toward the village square, she could hear Thomas continuing his instruction, his voice carrying the pride of a master craftsman sharing his expertise with eager students. Sarah's cell phone showed a single bar of battery life and no signal, its screen casting a dim blue glow in the darkness of the guest cabin. She held it like a lifeline, desperately trying different positions near the window, hoping to catch even the faintest connection to the outside world. The device represented her last link to civilization, to a reality where children didn't learn butchery as a sacred art, and communities didn't sustain themselves through ritualized murder. Michael sat on his narrow bed, his face pale in the lamplight. He had been largely silent since returning from Matthias's house, processing the historical revelations and their horrifying implications. When Sarah had shared what she'd witnessed at Thomas's workshop, the last vestiges of his hope for a reasonable explanation had crumbled. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond their cabin walls. "Tonight, before they decide we've learned too much." "The boy at dinner," Michael said quietly, when he asked about long pig and the girl with her recipe book. "They're not just eating it, Sarah. They're raising their children to see it as normal." Sarah tried her phone again, climbing onto the wooden chair beneath the window to angle it toward the mountains. For a brief moment, a single bar appeared on the screen, then vanished before she could place a call. The isolation that made this valley perfect for the villagers' purposes also made it nearly impossible to contact the outside world. "Matthias mentioned that people who find this place rarely leave," she said, stepping down from the chair. "I don't think that's because they fall in love with the simple life." Through the cabin's small window, they could see the village settling into its nighttime routine. Families were finishing their evening activities, children being called inside for bed, lamps being extinguished one by one. The peaceful domesticity of the scene made their situation more surreal and terrifying. Michael pulled out their trail map and spread it on the small table, trying to remember the route they had taken to reach the valley. "We came down from the northeast ridge. If we can get back to that high ground, we might be able to get a signal and call for help." "Assuming they let us leave," Sarah said grimly. "Did you notice how many people were watching us during dinner? How the conversation stopped when we walked by? We're not guests here, Michael. We're being evaluated." She moved to her backpack and quietly began organizing their essential supplies: food, water, basic first aid, the emergency beacon she hoped would work once they reached higher elevation. Every item had to be chosen carefully, nothing that would make noise or weigh them down during what would likely need to be a desperate flight through unfamiliar terrain. "What about the children?" Michael asked suddenly. "Emma and Timothy, all the others. They don't understand what they're part of. They're victims too." Sarah paused in her packing, the ethical implications of their escape weighing heavily. "We can't save them tonight, but if we can get word to the authorities, maybe someone can help them. Right now, we're the only ones who know this place exists and what's happening here." A soft knock at their door made both of them freeze. Sarah quickly stuffed her phone into her pocket and tried to look casual as Martha's voice came through the wooden barrier. "I hope you're settling in comfortably. I wanted to bring you some extra blankets for the night. Mountain temperatures can drop unexpectedly." Sarah opened the door to find Martha standing with an armload of wool blankets, her expression pleasant but her eyes watchful. Behind her, Sarah could see two men standing near the village well, ostensibly engaged in conversation, but positioned to observe anyone moving around the square. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful," Sarah managed, accepting the blankets while trying to appear grateful rather than terrified. "The morning will bring fresh challenges," Martha said, her words carrying an ambiguity that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Elder Matthias hopes you'll join us for breakfast. We have some important matters to discuss regarding your future plans." After Martha left, Sarah and Michael waited in tense silence for nearly an hour before attempting to move. The village had grown quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or the hoot of an owl from the surrounding forest. When they finally crept to the window, they could see guards had been posted at strategic points around the square. "They're not trying to hide it anymore," Michael observed. "We're prisoners." Sarah checked her phone one more time. The battery was down to a sliver, and still no signal. Tomorrow's important discussion would likely involve a choice between joining the community permanently or becoming part of their next meal. "We go tonight," she decided. "Once the guards settle into their routine, if we can reach the ridge where we first saw the valley, we might have a chance." The weight of their situation pressed down on them like the mountain air itself. They were trapped in a place where nightmares had become tradition, where children learned horror as naturally as they learned to read and write. Outside their window, the last lamp in the village was extinguished, leaving only moonlight to illuminate their prison. The Women's Council met in the largest cabin at the village heart, its walls lined with shelves of preserved foods and ceremonial objects that spoke to generations of careful tradition. Around the central table sat 12 women, each wearing a necklace of polished bone pieces carved into intricate patterns that caught the lamplight like ivory jewelry. These were no ordinary ornaments, but sacred artifacts crafted from the remains of those who had honored the community with their sacrifice. Rebecca Thornton, the council's eldest member at 73, fingered her bone necklace as she spoke about the evening's pressing matter. Her necklace was the most elaborate, its centerpiece a carved pendant that had once been part of a human skull, transformed through careful artistry into something beautiful yet unmistakably macabre. "The outsiders have seen too much," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided the community through decades of difficult decisions. The children spoke freely at dinner, and Martha reports that the woman was asking pointed questions about our customs. Sarah, who had told Martha she needed to visit the outdoor facilities, crouched beneath the council house window, using her phone to record what she could of the conversation. The women inside spoke with the practical tone of people discussing livestock management or crop rotation, their matter-of-fact approach to human consumption more chilling than any dramatic pronouncement could have been. "Emma showed her recipe book to the female visitor," added another woman, her own bone necklace featuring smaller, more delicate pieces. "The child doesn't understand the need for discretion. She's proud of what she's learned." Margaret Foster, a woman in her 50s who served as the village primary teacher, touched the bone pendant at her throat. "We've raised our children to feel no shame about our ways. They see the beauty in our traditions, the sacred nature of our sustenance. But that openness becomes dangerous when outsiders witness it." The bone necklaces had been a tradition for 3 generations, each piece carefully prepared and blessed before being incorporated into these symbols of status and devotion. The eldest women wore pieces from the community's most significant harvests, including fragments from the first deliberate killing in 1847 and subsequent victims who had provided particularly meaningful sustenance during difficult times. "What does Elder Matthias propose?" asked Catherine Webb, whose necklace bore the distinctive marking of a former council leader. Rebecca stood and moved to a carved wooden box that sat on a shelf behind her chair. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, lay additional bone pieces waiting to be incorporated into future necklaces. "He believes we should offer them the choice, join our community fully, understanding our ways and accepting our customs, or provide for the community in the way the mountain intended." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the brutal reality of the choice being offered. Sarah felt her hands trembling as she held her phone, trying to capture evidence of this casual discussion of murder. "The man seems weak," observed Martha, who had spent the most time with the visitors. easily frightened, likely to resist rather than adapt, but the woman has the backbone for survival. She asks difficult questions because she seeks understanding, not because she judges. Helen Morrison, Thomas's wife, fingered a bone pendant carved with intricate geometric patterns. Thomas believes the woman would make a valuable addition to our community. She has the intelligence to appreciate our ways once she understands their necessity. The man, however, lacks the stomach for truth. Sarah realized with growing horror that the women were essentially deciding which of them might be converted and which would be consumed. The clinical nature of their evaluation made her skin crawl, as if she and Michael were livestock being assessed for different purposes. The children have grown fond of them, Catherine noted. Emma has been asking if they'll stay permanently. She wants to teach the woman her recipes, show her the proper ways to prepare the sacred meals. That fondness could work in our favor, Rebecca agreed. Children often sense who will adapt to our ways. Their instincts about people are usually sound. Margaret leaned forward, her teacher's training evident in her careful analysis. We must consider the risks of either choice. If we allow them to leave, they carry knowledge that could bring the outside world to our valley. If we keep them unwillingly, they become a source of constant disruption and potential rebellion. The women discussed logistics with the same attention to detail that any community group might bring to planning a church social or school fundraiser. They talked about timing, method, and the practical considerations of dealing with outsiders who lacked the community's moral framework for understanding their choices. The harvest ritual should be performed according to tradition, Rebecca decided. If they choose poorly, we honor them in the proper way. If they choose wisdom, we welcome them into our circle with the understanding that they too must wear the sacred bones. Sarah backed away from the window. Her evidence gathered but her hope diminished. The women's matter-of-fact planning made it clear that tomorrow's discussion would be their last chance to escape, and that chance was looking increasingly slim. Sarah slipped back into the guest cabin, her heart pounding from what she had witnessed at the Women's Council meeting. The hand-drawn escape map she had sketched earlier lay spread across the small table, marking potential routes out of the valley based on her memory of their arrival. Every line represented hope and desperation in equal measure. Michael looked up from where he sat on his bed, fully dressed and ready to move. "What did you find out?" "We're going to die tomorrow if we don't leave tonight," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, even in the cabin's silence. "They're planning to give us a choice between joining them or becoming their next meal, and they're discussing it like they're planning a dinner party." She showed him the brief video she had managed to capture on her phone, the women's casual conversation about harvest rituals and sacred bones providing chilling evidence of the community's true nature. Michael's face grew progressively paler as he listened to the matter-of-fact discussion of their fate. "The bone necklaces," Sarah continued, "they're made from their victims. These people have been doing this for so long that they've turned it into art, into religious artifact. We're not just dealing with desperate cannibals, Michael. We're dealing with a sophisticated culture built around systematic murder." Michael stood and moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains at the village square. The guards were still in position, but their posture suggested routine rather than high alert. Two men near the well, one by the main path, and I think I saw someone moving near the storage buildings. They're not expecting us to run tonight. Sarah folded the escape map and tucked it into her jacket pocket along with her dying phone. "The northeast ridge is our best option. It's the route we know, and if we can reach high ground, we might get a signal to call for help." They had packed their essential supplies hours earlier, keeping their backpacks light but including everything necessary for survival in the mountains. Water, energy bars, basic first aid, and the emergency beacon Sarah prayed would function once they escaped the valley's natural signal-blocking terrain. "What about evidence?" Michael asked. "If something happens to us, how will anyone know what we found here?" Sarah pulled out a small digital camera she had brought for documenting their hiking trip. "I've been taking pictures and video all day. The camera has better battery life than my phone, and the memory card is waterproof. If we don't make it out, maybe someone will find it and understand what happened here." She had documented everything she could: the village layout, the workshop where Thomas trained his apprentices, images of the children's casual behavior around their horrific meals, and most importantly, video of the Women's Council discussing their plans. The camera represented more than evidence. It was their testimony to the outside world. "Wait," Michael said suddenly, pointing toward the square. "The guard by the well just left his position. This might be our chance." They watched through the window as one of the sentries walked toward what appeared to be the communal outhouse, leaving a gap in their surveillance coverage. The timing would never be perfect, but this was as close as they were likely to get. Sarah shouldered her backpack and checked her jacket pockets one final time. Phone, camera, map, the small knife from her hiking kit. Everything that might help them survive the night ahead. "We go to the tree line behind the cabin, then work our way around to the northeast slope. Stay low, move quietly, and if we get separated, head for the ridge where we first saw the valley." Michael nodded, his face grim, but determined. "What about when they discover we're gone? They'll organize a search party. Then we better have a good head start," Sarah replied. "These people have been hunting humans for over a century. They'll know these mountains better than we do, and they'll be motivated to keep their secrets safe." They waited until the remaining guards seemed settled into their posts, then quietly opened the cabin door. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of the stream that ran through the village. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, their own breathing, the soft crunch of their footsteps on fallen leaves, the whisper of wind through the trees. Sarah led the way toward the forest edge, keeping the cabin between them and the guards' line of sight. Behind them the village slept peacefully, its inhabitants unaware that their carefully maintained secret was about to be exposed to the outside world. At the tree line, Sarah paused to look back at the collection of buildings where generations of children had learned to see cannibalism as natural as breathing. In a few hours, when Martha came to collect them for breakfast and found empty beds, this place would transform from a sleepy mountain community into a hunting ground. She and Michael had perhaps 6 hours of darkness to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the most dangerous predators they had ever encountered. The ancient tracking horn's deep, resonant call echoed across the valley at dawn, its mournful tone carrying a message that every villager understood. Sarah and Michael had been climbing through dense forest for 4 hours when the sound reached them, freezing their blood and confirming their worst fears. The hunt had begun. Elder Matthias stood in the village square, the brass horn still at his lips as the last notes faded into the mountain air. Around him, the community mobilized with the efficiency of long practice. This was not their first hunt for escaped outsiders, and every person knew their role in the carefully orchestrated pursuit that would follow. Thomas emerged from his workshop carrying a leather satchel of specialized tools, his face grim with professional focus. Behind him came his 2 apprentices, Marcus and David, eager to participate in their first real hunt. The boys had trained for this moment, learning to track human prey through the same methodical instruction they had received in butchery. "They have perhaps 6 hours advantage," Matthias announced to the gathering villagers. "But they're unfamiliar with these mountains and carrying city-dweller supplies. We know every trail, every hiding place, every route that leads out of our valley." Martha Brennan joined the group, her face showing disappointment rather than anger. "I offered them hospitality. They repaid it with betrayal and theft of our sacred knowledge. They've forfeited any claim to mercy." The villagers organized into 3 hunting parties, each taking a different route up the mountainside. The arrangement ensured that no matter which direction the fugitives had chosen, at least one group would intersect their path. Years of hunting both animals and humans had taught them the value of systematic coverage and patient pursuit. Sarah and Michael heard the horn's second call as they scrambled up a steep slope of loose shale, their hands bleeding from gripping sharp rocks for balance. The sound seemed closer now, and Sarah realized with growing panic that their pursuers were moving faster than expected. "They know these mountains," Michael gasped, his city-dweller conditioning no match for the sustained climb. "We're not going to outrun them on their own territory." Sarah pulled out her GPS device, praying for a satellite signal that might help them navigate more efficiently. The screen showed their approximate position, but no clear route to safety. Every direction seemed to lead deeper into wilderness that favored the hunters over the hunted. Below them, Thomas's group moved through the forest with the silent efficiency of predators. The boys followed his lead, learning to read broken branches, disturbed earth, and other signs that city dwellers left in their way. Their quarry was making good time, but also leaving an obvious trail for those who knew how to read it. "Uncle Thomas," Marcus whispered, pointing to a cluster of scuff marks on a fallen log. "They rested here." The woman's smaller footprints show she was struggling with the pace. Thomas examined the sign with professional interest. "Good eye. They're moving northeast, toward the high ridge, probably hoping to get a cell signal or reach the main hiking trail. We can cut them off at the rock face near Eagle's Point." The hunting party adjusted their route, using knowledge passed down through generations to anticipate their quarry's most likely path. This was more than pursuit. It was a chess game played across miles of treacherous terrain, with human lives as the stake. Sarah's phone finally picked up a weak signal as they climbed above the tree line, its screen showing a single bar that flickered in and out of existence. She tried to dial 911, but the call failed to connect, leaving her with the mocking display of an emergency system that couldn't reach them in their desperate hour. "There," Michael pointed toward a gap in the ridgeline ahead. "If we can reach that pass, we might be able to get down the other side before they catch us." But their hopes were shattered by the sound of voices echoing off the rock walls around them. The second hunting party had anticipated their route and was already positioning themselves to block the escape route. Sarah realized with sick certainty that they were being herded like animals toward a predetermined killing ground. The villagers' hunting calls began to coordinate between the groups, a system of whistles and shouts that allowed them to communicate their quarry's position without modern technology. It was a language developed over decades of practice, refined through successful hunts that had kept their community's secrets safe. Thomas raised his hand to signal a halt as his group reached a vantage point overlooking the fugitives' likely path. Through the trees below, he could see movement that suggested their quarry was tiring, making more noise, leaving clearer signs of their passage. "Remember," he told his apprentices quietly, "this is about protecting our community and our way of life. These outsiders chose to violate our hospitality and steal our sacred knowledge. What we do today serves a purpose greater than individual mercy." The horn sounded again, closer now, its call seeming to come from multiple directions as the hunting parties closed their trap around two desperate people who had learned too much about a secret that had been kept for over a century. The entrance to the underground chambers lay hidden beneath a collapsed section of forest floor, concealed by decades of accumulated leaves and deliberately planted vegetation. Sarah stumbled upon it while scrambling down a steep embankment, her foot breaking through what appeared to be solid ground into a void below. The discovery might have been their salvation, except for what they found waiting in the darkness beneath. Michael helped pull her from the hole, but the smell that emerged stopped them both cold. It was the stench of human habitation mixed with something far worse, something that spoke of long confinement and systematic brutality. Sarah's camera captured the moment when she shone her flashlight down into the opening, revealing wooden steps descending into carefully constructed underground rooms. "We have to see," Sarah whispered, though every instinct screamed against descending into that reeking darkness. "If there are people down there, we might be able to help them." The breeding records Thomas kept were meticulous in their documentation, leather-bound ledgers that chronicled the village's most horrific secret. Each page detailed the systematic management of human livestock, tracking bloodlines, breeding schedules, and harvest rotations with the same clinical precision that any rancher might apply to cattle management. The underground complex had been excavated over decades, carved from the mountain's natural cave system and reinforced with timber and stone. Multiple chambers housed different categories of captives: breeding stock, children being conditioned for eventual harvest, and individuals being fattened for immediate consumption. The operation's scope revealed a level of planning and organization that transformed isolated cannibalism into industrial-scale human farming. The song spoke of Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding paths they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Michael Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of grey rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested, hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest, they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world, but this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads." "We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working, and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brent. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her unease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes. Children peered curiously from doorways while adults watched with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained as they walked. "Perhaps once or twice a year, if that. Most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy, but clean and warm." Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires, their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching, but something in their excitement struck her as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. The mountain's safety, of coming home to warmth and food, a family waiting with open arms. To the untrained ear, it sounded like a charming folk tradition. To those who understood its purpose, it was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind. "Come back to us, lost ones," Emma sang, her voice echoing off the rock walls of the canyon, where Sarah and Michael had taken refuge. "The mountain is cold and hungry tonight, but we have warm fires and full tables waiting." Behind the children's innocent voices came the deeper tones of the adult hunters, creating a harmony that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The villagers had discovered that escapees often responded to the sound of children singing, their natural protective instincts overriding survival logic when young voices seemed to be in distress. Sarah pressed herself against the canyon wall, fighting every maternal instinct that urged her to respond to what sounded like lost children calling for help. The psychological manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to exploit the emotional vulnerabilities that made people human. She forced herself to remember Emma's recipe book, the casual way the child discussed human meat preparation, the innocent enthusiasm with which she approached cannibalism. Michael gripped her arm, recognizing the internal struggle she was fighting. "It's not real," he whispered. "Remember what we saw in those chambers. Remember what these people really are." The children's voices grew closer, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the villagers were actually using their own sons and daughters as bait. Emma, Timothy, and the other young ones had been positioned strategically throughout the search area, their pure voices serving as sirens to lure the fugitives into revealing their location. "We know you're scared," came Timothy's voice from a different direction, his 5-year-old words carefully coached, but delivered with genuine emotion. "Mama says you're hurt and hungry. We brought you some of our special food, the kind that makes everything better." The psychological assault intensified as the children began to tell stories, their innocent voices sharing memories of the dinners they had shared with Sarah and Michael. They spoke of how much they had enjoyed the visitors' company, how they had hoped the strangers would stay and become part of their family forever. "Emma drew you a picture," called another child's voice. "She wants to show you her new recipes, the ones Uncle Thomas taught her yesterday after you went to sleep." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the manipulation continued. The villagers understood human psychology with the expertise of predators who had been studying their prey for over a century. They knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, which vulnerabilities to exploit. The children began to move through the forest in a coordinated pattern, their voices creating an acoustic net that made it impossible to determine their exact position. The singing served multiple purposes. It masked the sound of the adult hunters moving into position, it provided psychological pressure on the fugitives, and it established a communication system that allowed the hunting parties to coordinate without revealing their tactical position. "Papa, Matthias says you're probably cold," Emma's voice called out, closer now and filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "He says sometimes grown-ups get confused when they're scared and hungry, but we understand. We still love you, even if you ran away." The cruel genius of the strategy became clear as Sarah realized the children weren't just bait, they were weapons specifically designed to exploit human compassion. Anyone who responded to their calls for help would be revealing their location to the hunt. Anyone who remained hidden had to listen to the sounds of children who seemed lost and frightened, fighting against every instinct that defined them as human. Michael pointed toward a gap in the canyon wall where they might be able to climb higher, but the route would require them to cross an open area where the children's voices seemed to be converging. The psychological pressure of the singing was driving them toward increasingly desperate choices. "We brought you presents," Timothy's voice added, his words carrying the excitement of a child eager to share. "Special presents from the mountain. The kind that help you understand why we love it here so much." Sarah forced herself to photograph the scene with her camera, documenting this psychological warfare for the evidence she was accumulating. The image of children being weaponized by their own parents and community represented perhaps the most chilling aspect of what they had discovered. The lullaby continued, its innocent melody serving as the soundtrack for a hunt that would determine whether the village's century-old secret would finally be exposed to the outside world. Behind the children's pure voices, Sarah could hear the patient breathing of adult predators closing in for the kill. The blood trail markers began appearing as Sarah and Michael climbed toward the highest ridge, stone cairns stacked in deliberate patterns and marked with dark stains that could only be human blood. Each marker represented a successful hunt from the village past, waypoints in a systematic network that guided future pursuits through the treacherous mountain terrain. Thomas moved through the forest with the confidence of someone following a well-traveled path, even though no visible trail existed. His apprentices followed closely, learning to read the subtle signs that had been left by generations of hunters. The blood-marked stones weren't just navigation aids, they were monuments to the village's success in keeping their secrets safe. "Each marker represents a lesson learned," Thomas explained quietly to Marcus and David, as they paused beside a particularly elaborate cairn. "This one marks where the university researchers were finally cornered in 1987. 3 academics who thought they could document our primitive customs for their anthropology journals. The stone structure bore multiple bloodstains, each one carefully applied and renewed over the years as a form of ritualistic maintenance. The villagers treated these markers as sacred objects, honoring both the successful hunts they commemorated and the victims who had contributed to the community's survival." Sarah's lungs burned as she and Michael pushed through the high-altitude terrain, their city-conditioned bodies struggling with the thin air and relentless climb. Behind them, the hunting horns continued to sound, their calls coordinating a pursuit that seemed to be closing from multiple directions simultaneously. "They're herding us," Sarah gasped, consulting her hand-drawn map against the landscape around them. "Every time we change direction, they're there to push us back onto this route." Michael pointed toward a narrow passage between 2 rock formations ahead. "That's the only way through to the main ridge. If we can reach it, we might be able to get down the other side before they catch us." But as they approached the passage, they discovered another blood-marked cairn positioned directly in their path. This one was larger than the others, its stones carefully arranged to form an altar-like structure. Fresh blood stained the rocks, suggesting recent use, and the smell of decay lingered in the thin mountain air. The marker served as more than navigation. It was a psychological weapon designed to demoralize those who discovered it. Carved into the largest stone were tally marks, dozens of them, each representing a successful hunt that had ended at this strategic location. The passage represented a killing ground, chosen for its tactical advantages and blessed by decades of violent success. Thomas's group had positioned themselves above the passage, using the elevated terrain to observe their quarry's approach. The blood trail markers had guided Sarah and Michael exactly where the hunters wanted them, toward a location where escape routes were limited and the advantage belonged entirely to those who knew the terrain. "Remember what I taught you about the final approach," Thomas whispered to his apprentices. "Patience is more important than speed. Let them exhaust themselves against the mountain before we close the trap." The apprentices nodded, their young faces showing the excitement of participating in their first real hunt. They had trained for this moment through years of tracking animals and learning the psychological techniques that made human prey predictable in its desperation. Sarah pulled out her camera and began recording, understanding that these might be her final moments to document the evidence she had gathered. The blood-marked stones provided visual proof of the village's systematic approach to murder, each cairn representing not just successful hunts, but a network of killing grounds that stretched throughout the mountain region. "If we don't make it," she said to Michael. "The camera has everything. The underground chambers, the breeding records, the children's involvement, all of it." Michael took the camera and memory card, sealing them in a waterproof pouch from his hiking gear. "Where should I hide it?" "Somewhere they won't think to..." Sarah pointed to a deep crack in the rock wall beside them. "There, if searchers ever come looking for us, they might find it. It's our only chance to expose what these people have been doing." The hunting horn sounded again, much closer now, and the children's voices had grown silent. The psychological warfare phase of the hunt was ending, replaced by the direct confrontation that would determine whether the village's secrets remained hidden for another generation. Thomas raised his hand to signal his apprentices as their quarry came into view below. The blood trail markers had done their work, guiding the fugitives to exactly the right location for a clean kill that would leave no evidence for outside authorities to discover. "This is how we protect our way of life," he told the boys quietly. "This is how we honor our ancestors and ensure our children inherit the wisdom they need to survive." The final approach began, with predators who had been perfecting their craft for over a century, closing in on prey who had learned too much about humanity's capacity for organized evil. The park ranger's radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m. as Ranger William Chen sat in his station, nursing his third cup of coffee and wondering why he had volunteered for the overnight shift. The voice that came through the static was female, desperate, and barely coherent with exhaustion and terror. "Emergency. Emergency. This is Sarah Martinez. GPS coordinates. Oh God, they're coming." The transmission cut off mid-sentence, leaving only static and the sound of the wind through the mountain peaks. Chen grabbed his logbook and began documenting the call, noting the timestamp and the fragmentary coordinates he thought he had heard. In 15 years of ranger service, he had received hundreds of distress calls, but something about this one made his skin crawl. Sarah's fingers trembled as she tried the radio again, having finally reached high enough elevation to connect with the Park Service's emergency frequency. Behind her, Michael lay unconscious against a boulder, blood seeping from a head wound where he had fallen during their desperate climb. She had managed to drag him to this exposed ridge, but the effort had cost them precious time and energy they couldn't afford to lose. "Please respond. This is Sarah Martinez. We found a village. They're killing people. Systematic cannibalism. Underground chambers full of victims." The words tumbled out in a rush as she tried to convey the magnitude of what they had discovered before her pursuers reached the ridge. She could hear the hunting party below, their voices calling back and forth as they coordinated their final assault on her position. Ranger Chen leaned forward, his pen poised over the emergency report form. The woman's words were almost too incredible to believe, but her terror seemed genuine. He had heard enough false emergency calls to recognize the difference between pranks and real distress. "This is Ranger Station 7 responding to emergency call. Can you repeat your location and the nature of your emergency?" Sarah's relief at hearing a human voice from the outside world nearly overwhelmed her. "Hidden Valley, northeast of your station. Village practicing cannibalism for over a century. They have prisoners. Breeding program. Children taught to see it as normal." The transmission began breaking up as her radio's battery weakened, but Chen managed to catch enough fragments to understand that someone was claiming to have discovered a community of cannibals. The story sounded like something from a horror movie, but the woman's voice carried a conviction that made him take it seriously. "We're sending a team to your location," Chen radioed back. "Can you stay on this frequency?" "They're here," Sarah whispered into the radio as she saw figures emerging from the tree line below. Thomas and his apprentices had reached the ridge, their faces grim with the determination of hunters closing in for the kill. "The village, Haven Valley. Look for the blood-marked stone underground chambers. Tell them about the children." The radio went silent as Sarah was forced to abandon her position, scrambling across the rocky terrain toward what appeared to be the only remaining escape route. Chen stared at his equipment, wondering if he had just received the most important emergency call of his career, or the desperate fantasy of someone suffering from exposure and exhaustion. He decided to treat it as real. Within minutes, Chen had contacted the county sheriff's office, the state police, and the FBI field office in the regional capital. The story sounded unbelievable. but the coordinates the woman had provided placed her in an area of the mountains that was largely unmapped and rarely visited by hikers or hunters. "We need search and rescue teams and a full investigation unit," Chen told Sheriff Patricia Morrison over the phone. "I don't know what we're going to find up there, but if even half of what this woman claimed is true, we're dealing with something that's been hidden in our mountains for decades." Sheriff Morrison, a 20-year veteran of mountain law enforcement, had heard stranger stories that turned out to be true. "How many people are we talking about? How isolated is this area?" The caller mentioned prisoners, underground facilities, systematic operation. "If there's a community up there that's been operating without outside contact, they could have been hiding anything." As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, multiple agencies began mobilizing for what would become the largest search and rescue operation in the region's history. Helicopters were dispatched from 3 different bases, mountain rescue teams assembled their equipment, and federal agents prepared for the possibility of discovering evidence of crimes that would shock the nation. Sarah's desperate radio call had succeeded in alerting the outside world, but whether she and Michael would survive long enough to see the rescue teams arrive remained an open question. The hunting party was now less than 100 yards away, and her options for escape were disappearing as quickly as her strength. The FBI evidence box would eventually overflow with the disturbing artifacts recovered from Haven Valley, each item tagged and catalogued as documentation of humanity's capacity for systematic evil. Agent Rebecca Torres supervised the collection process, her 20 years of federal investigation experience providing no preparation for the scope of horror they were uncovering. The helicopters had arrived at dawn, their rotors echoing off the mountain walls as they approached the coordinates Sarah had transmitted. The village below appeared deceptively peaceful in the morning light, smoke rising from chimneys and children playing in the central square, as if this were any normal mountain community. Elder Matthias stood in the village center as the aircraft circled overhead, his face showing resignation rather than surprise. The hunting party had failed to silence the outsiders in time, and now the outside world had come to Haven Valley with all the force of modern law-enforced. "Children, go to your homes," he called out calmly. "Stay inside with your families until the visitors leave." The federal agents who rappelled from the helicopters found a community that seemed frozen in time, its inhabitants watching their arrival with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. The villagers offered no resistance to the initial search, but their cooperation carried an undercurrent of defiance that suggested they believed their way of life was worth defending. Agent Torres approached a woman hanging laundry behind one of the cabins, noting the anachronistic clothing and the careful way the villager avoided making eye contact. "Ma'am, we're investigating reports of missing persons and possible criminal activity in this area. Do you know anything about 2 hikers who may have visited your community recently?" Martha Brennan's response was carefully neutral. "We sometimes see lost travelers pass through. The mountains can be dangerous for those unfamiliar with the terrain." But the evidence box was already beginning to fill with items that suggested a far different story. In Thomas's workshop, agents discovered the ceremonial cleaver, with its ornate engravings and suspicious stains. Forensic experts would later confirm that the residue contained human blood from multiple individuals, some of it dating back decades. The underground chambers proved even more damning. FBI teams equipped with specialized lighting systems descended into the complex network of rooms and tunnels, their cameras documenting a systematic operation that defied belief. The breeding records alone filled 3 evidence boxes, their clinical documentation of human livestock management, providing incontrovertible proof of the village's true nature. Agent Michael Harrison, the team's forensic anthropologist, examined the bone artifacts found throughout the village with growing amazement. The necklaces worn by the Women's Council, the decorative objects in various homes, even children's toys carved from human remains. The villagers had transformed their victims into art, creating a material culture built entirely around cannibalism. "I've never seen anything like this," Harrison told Torres as they catalogued the bone artifacts. "It's not just evidence of murder, it's evidence of a complete cultural system built around human consumption. They've industrialized cannibalism." The living victims found in the underground chambers presented the most challenging aspect of the investigation. 12 people in various stages of physical and psychological degradation, some of whom had been captive for years. The youngest captives required immediate medical attention, while the oldest seemed unable to comprehend that rescue had finally arrived. Dr. Sarah Kim, the psychiatric specialist brought in to evaluate the rescued victims, found herself confronting trauma on a scale she had never encountered. "These people have been systematically dehumanized," she explained to the assembled investigators. "Some of them have been conditioned to see their captivity as normal, even necessary." The village children pose perhaps the most complex challenge for the authorities. How do you prosecute children who have been raised to see cannibalism as natural? How do you rehabilitate young minds that have been shaped by generations of normalized horror? Emma Brennan sat in the temporary command center, her recipe book open on the table as federal agents tried to understand the scope of her indoctrination. The 8-year-old answered their questions with the same innocent enthusiasm she had shown when explaining her cooking knowledge to Sarah and Michael. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. Agent Torres, with genuine confusion. "We were just doing what our families taught us. We were honoring the mountain's gifts the way our ancestors did." The evidence continued to accumulate as teams searched every building in the village. Documents detailing the systematic acquisition of victims, financial records showing how the community had remained self-sufficient through their horrific practices, and correspondence with other isolated communities that suggested Haven Valley was not unique in its approach to survival. By evening, the evidence boxes numbered in the dozens, each one containing artifacts that would require months of analysis to fully understand. The investigation had uncovered not just isolated cannibalism, but a sophisticated cultural system that had operated successfully for over a century. The villagers themselves remained largely silent, their cooperation extending only to basic compliance with federal authority. They showed no remorse for their actions, no recognition that their way of life constituted criminal behavior on a massive scale. The trial transcript would eventually span over 3,000 pages, documenting legal proceedings that challenged every precedent for prosecuting crimes that spanned multiple generations. Federal prosecutors faced the unprecedented task of building cases against defendants who viewed cannibalism as a fundamental right protected by religious freedom and community autonomy. Elder Matthias sat in the defendant's chair with the dignity of someone who believed history would vindicate his actions. At 78, he had spent his entire life in Haven Valley, raised from birth to see their practices as not normal, but morally superior to the violence and waste of mainstream society. "Your Honor," his defense attorney argued, "my client was born into a community with established customs and beliefs. He never chose these practices, he inherited them. To prosecute him for following the only way of life he has ever known raises serious questions about cultural autonomy and religious freedom." The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal scholars, and family members of identified victims. The case had captured international attention, forcing society to confront questions about the limits of cultural tolerance and the definition of civilization itself. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh presented evidence methodically, building a case that emphasized the systematic nature of the village's crimes. The breeding records, the underground chambers, the deliberate acquisition of victims through decades of organized hunting. This wasn't cultural tradition, she argued, but organized criminal enterprise disguised as religious practice. The defendants claimed they were following ancestral customs, Walsh told the jury, but the evidence shows careful planning and systematic execution of murder on an industrial scale. They created infrastructure specifically designed to facilitate human breeding and slaughter. They developed hunting techniques to acquire new victims. They indoctrinated children to perpetuate these crimes across generations. Thomas Brennan's testimony provided the most chilling insights into the village mindset. Speaking with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing any traditional craft, he explained the techniques passed down through his family for 6 generations. "We never saw ourselves as criminals," he said from the witness stand. "We saw ourselves as survivors, as people who had learned to live in harmony with the mountain's demand. The outside world calls us monsters, but they waste millions of animals every year while we honored every life that sustained us." The psychological evaluations presented complex pictures of defendants who showed no traditional signs of mental illness but had been shaped by a moral framework completely alien to mainstream society. Dr. Tricia Chen, the court-appointed psychiatrist, struggled to categorize individuals who committed horrific acts while displaying otherwise normal psychological profiles. "These are not sociopaths or psychopaths in the clinical sense," Dr. Chen explained to the court. "They are individuals who were systematically conditioned from birth to accept values that mainstream society finds abhorrent. They show empathy, form emotional bonds, and demonstrate moral reasoning within their cultural framework." The children's cases proved even more complex. How do you prosecute a teenager who participated in murder because it was the only reality they had ever known? The defense argued that the youngest defendants were victims themselves, conditioned by adults to participate in activities they couldn't fully understand. Emma Brennan, now 9 years old, had been placed in protective custody while psychologists attempted to assess her mental state. During her testimony, delivered via closed-circuit television to protect her from media attention, she demonstrated the thorough indoctrination she had received. "I don't understand why everyone is angry," she told the court psychologist. "We were careful with the special people. We thanked them and used everything so nothing was wasted. Uncle Thomas taught us that waste was the only real sin." The legal proceedings revealed fundamental questions about justice and rehabilitation. If the defendants genuinely believed their actions were moral and necessary, could they be held responsible under laws they had never acknowledged? If their children had been systematically brainwashed from birth, were they criminals or victims? International human rights organizations filed briefs arguing that cultural practices could never justify systematic murder, regardless of how deeply embedded they were in a community's traditions. Religious freedom advocates countered that prosecuting people for ancestral beliefs set dangerous precedents for government interference in minority communities. The evidence was overwhelming, but the legal framework for addressing crimes of this scope and cultural complexity was largely non-existent. Prosecutors had to rely on murder charges multiplied across dozens of victims, while defense attorneys argued for reduced sentences based on cultural conditioning and generational indoctrination. Sarah Martinez testified for 6 days, her account of the village's practices supported by the photographs and videos she had managed to preserve. Her testimony provided crucial insight into how the community operated, but also revealed the psychological toll of witnessing systematic evil disguised as tradition. They weren't monsters in the way we usually think of criminals, Sarah told the jury. They were a community that had convinced itself that horror was holiness, that murder was mercy. That's what made them so terrifying, and what makes this case so important for understanding how evil can become normalized across generations. The trial would continue for 8 months, raising questions about justice, culture, and human nature that legal scholars would debate for decades to come. The adoption files filled an entire cabinet at the Department of Social Services, each folder representing a child's journey from unspeakable horror to an uncertain future in mainstream society. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the department's specialist in extreme trauma cases, supervised the placement process with the understanding that these children presented challenges unlike any she had encountered in 20 years of social work. Emma Brennan, now 10 years old, sat in her new foster family's kitchen in suburban Denver, staring at a plate of chicken nuggets with an expression that her foster mother couldn't quite decipher. The Hendersons had been carefully selected for their experience with traumatized children, but nothing in their training had prepared them for a child who had been systematically conditioned to view human flesh as sacred food. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jennifer Henderson said gently. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry." And Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding paths they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Michael Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of grey rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested, hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world, but this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely, and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads." "We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working, and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brennan. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her unease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes. Children peered curiously from doorways, while adults watched with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained, as they walked, "perhaps once or twice a year. If that, most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy but clean and warm. Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires, their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching. But something in their excitement struck her as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. I looked up with eyes that held knowledge no child should possess. Is this meat from the grateful animals, the ones who gave their lives willingly? The question sent chills through Jennifer's heart, a reminder of the twisted moral framework that had shaped Emma's understanding of nutrition and sacrifice. The child's innocent voice carried concepts that adults struggled to process, ideas about gratitude and willing sacrifice that revealed the sophisticated indoctrination she had received. Timothy Brennan, now 7, had been placed with a family in Portland who specialized in children with severe psychological trauma. His adaptation process differed from his sisters in troubling ways. Where Emma asked questions about the morality of their new food sources, Timothy had begun refusing to eat anything at all. He's lost 12 pounds since placement, Dr. Sarah Kim reported during the monthly review meeting. He keeps asking when the real food will be available, when the special ceremonies will begin. He doesn't understand that chicken and beef are adequate substitutes for his previous diet. The younger children showed more promise for rehabilitation, their memories of life before Haven Valley less concrete, and their moral frameworks less firmly established. 3-year-old David Morrison had been placed with a family in Seattle and seemed to be adapting normally, though he occasionally asked disturbing questions about why their new meat didn't require special prayer. But the older children, particularly those who had reached adolescence in the village, presented far more complex challenges. Marcus Brennan, now 17, had been placed in a secure residential facility after 3 failed foster placements. His understanding of human relationships had been so fundamentally warped by his upbringing that normal social interaction proved nearly impossible. He evaluates every person he meets as potential food sources, explained Dr. Michael Torres, the facility's director. Not with malicious intent, but as an automatic response developed through years of conditioning. He'll assess someone's weight, muscle development, and health status with the clinical eye of someone trained to evaluate livestock. The adoption files revealed a spectrum of success and failure that correlated directly with the children's ages at rescue. Those under 5 showed remarkable resilience, adapting to normal family life with appropriate therapeutic support. Children between 5 and 10 required intensive intervention, but showed progress toward healthy social integration. The teenagers, however, remained largely unreachable through conventional therapy. Their moral frameworks had been so thoroughly established that they couldn't accept the fundamental premise that their previous way of life was wrong. They complied with rules and regulations, but maintained an internal belief system that saw their captivity as punishment for abandoning sacred traditions. Emma's foster parents received weekly counseling to help them navigate the complex challenges of raising a child who had been systematically taught that compassion meant efficient killing and gratitude meant consuming the dead. The girl's intelligence and emotional sensitivity made her indoctrination more tragic, as she clearly wanted to please her new family, but couldn't understand why they found her values disturbing. She drew me a picture yesterday, Jennifer Henderson told Dr. Rodriguez during their session. It showed our family sitting around a dinner table, but the food she drew was clearly human body parts. When I asked her about it, she said she was showing me how grateful we should be for our meals. The most successful placements involved families who had been thoroughly educated about the children's backgrounds and trained in specialized therapeutic techniques. These families understood that traditional discipline methods were inappropriate for children who had been raised to see death as sacred and violence as worship. Some children proved unable to adapt to life outside institutional care. Peter Thornton, 15 at the time of rescue, had been transferred between 6 different facilities before being permanently housed in a psychiatric institution. His complete inability to form normal human attachments, combined with his persistent belief that his captors had been morally superior to his rescuers, made him unsuitable for family placement. "We're essentially trying to deprogram children who were raised in a cult," Rodriguez explained to the Oversight Committee. But this wasn't just any cult. It was a community with over a century of established traditions and sophisticated indoctrination techniques. Some of these children may never fully integrate into mainstream society. The files documented both heartbreaking failures and inspiring successes, creating a complex picture of resilience and trauma that would influence child psychology research for decades to come. Sarah's published memoir, The Weight of Darkness, A Journey into Humanity's Hidden Evil, sat at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 37 weeks. Its stark black cover bearing only the title and her name in simple white letters. The book had become more than a personal account of survival. It served as a warning about how isolation and desperation could corrupt the fundamental values that define civilization. The book signing at Powell's Books in Portland drew a crowd that stretched around the block, people drawn not by morbid curiosity, but by a genuine need to understand how such horrors could exist in the modern world. Sarah, now 3 years removed from her ordeal, had found purpose in sharing her story and advocating for the children who continued to struggle with rehabilitation. "The question everyone asks me," Sarah told the audience during her reading, "is how an entire community could normalize something so fundamentally evil. But I think that's the wrong question. The real question is how we can prevent isolation from breeding the kind of moral corruption that allows evil to become tradition." Her memoir detailed not just the village's horrific practices, but the systematic way they had justified their actions across generations. She wrote about the children's innocent enthusiasm for cannibalism, the adults' genuine belief in their moral superiority, and the way isolation had allowed their community to develop completely outside the ethical frameworks that govern human society. The academic community had embraced Sarah's account as crucial documentation of how cultural practices could evolve in isolation. Universities offered courses examining the psychological and sociological implications of the Haven Valley case, using her memoir as primary source material for understanding extremist communities and systematic indoctrination. Robert Chen, now director of the Institute for Cultural Anthropology at Berkeley, had made the Haven Valley case the centerpiece of his research into isolated communities worldwide. Sarah's memoir provides invaluable insight into how human societies can develop moral frameworks that seem incomprehensible to mainstream culture, he explained to his graduate students. "It forces us to examine the assumptions we make about universal human values." The international response to Sarah's book had prompted investigations into other isolated communities around the world, some of which revealed similar patterns of extreme practices developed through generations of separation from broader society. Governments began implementing monitoring systems to identify communities that might be developing dangerous customs in isolation. Mental health professionals used Sarah's detailed observations to develop new therapeutic approaches for treating victims of systematic indoctrination. Her descriptions of the children's psychological state provided crucial insights into how young minds could be shaped to accept the unacceptable, leading to breakthrough treatments for cult survivors and victims of extreme abuse. The memoir's most powerful chapter focused on her final encounter with Emma Brennan, now 13 and living with her adoptive family in Denver. Sarah had visited the girl as part of her research for the book, seeking to understand how the children were adapting to their new lives. "She's a remarkable child," Sarah wrote, "intelligent, artistic, and capable of deep empathy. But there's a disconnect between her emotional responses and her moral framework that may never fully heal. She understands intellectually that her previous life was wrong, but she can't feel that wrongness in her heart." The meeting had been both heartbreaking and hopeful, revealing a young woman struggling to build a new identity while carrying the psychological scars of her upbringing. Emma's foster parents reported significant progress, but also acknowledged that certain aspects of her conditioning might never be completely overcome. Sarah's advocacy work had led to the establishment of the Haven Valley Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting the rehabilitation of the surviving children and preventing similar tragedies through early intervention in isolated communities. The foundation had identified 12 other communities worldwide that showed concerning patterns of extreme practices developing in isolation. The children are not monsters, Sarah emphasized in every interview and speaking engagement. They are victims of a system that taught them to see horror as holiness. Our responsibility is to help them heal, not to judge them for beliefs they never chose. The memoir's final chapter reflected on the broader implications of the Haven Valley case for understanding human nature and social development. Sarah argued that the village's evolution from desperate survival to systematic evil demonstrated how quickly moral frameworks could deteriorate without external accountability and diverse perspectives. Isolation breeds extremism, she concluded, whether that extremism takes the form of religious fanaticism, political radicalization, or in this case the normalization of cannibalism. The lesson of Haven Valley is not that humans are inherently evil, but that we require community, diversity, and constant moral reflection to remain human. The book had sparked a global conversation about the responsibilities of governments and international organizations to monitor isolated communities while respecting cultural autonomy. Sarah's story had become a catalyst for policy changes that balanced cultural freedom with basic human rights protections. Years after her escape from the mountains, Sarah Martinez had transformed her trauma into a force for protecting others from similar horrors.